The last time that we gathered, we heard about catastrophic consequences when people turned away from God. We learned about how evil completely engulfed the people, and so God needed to engulf the evil and caused a great flood. And yet, one man who was righteous, Noah, he saved him and his family and began anew. But guess what happened? They continued the same way that they had been. Even a catastrophic flood did not change the hearts of humanity. And so to save us from ourselves in a broken world, God continued to go with us. God continued to be there, and He chose one family, one man in that family, to go and continue His blessing to all of the world. And that man was named Abraham. That was the man that I started with this morning. That old man that was about to plunge his knife into his son, that was Abraham? How in the world did he come to a place like that? What happened? Well, he started out as Abram. He was the son of Terah, and he lived in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, I always was happy about that because, anytime you have a historical figure that's from a place that's really easy to remember, it's good for the tests later. So it was. I was always thankful to Abraham when they said, "Where was Abraham from?" I could go, Ur, and they went, "Right." Okay. He was from Ur. But he couldn't stay in a place that was that easy to remember, of course. And so he went on to Haran with his father Terah and his nephew Lot. But they settled there, and after many years, the Lord came to Abram.
God told Abram, "Leave your country, your family, and your father's home for a land that I will show you. I'll make you a great nation and bless you. I'll make you famous. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I'll curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you."
I love that. You are blessed to be a blessing. But there's something at the beginning of there that is really important that I tend to forget. First thing God told him was go. He was a sent person. We are a sent people. God's command to Abram, go. Leave? Leave what? My source of comfort? My country, my people, to go where and do what? How scary that was. But Abram went because God promised something greater. He promised that I will give you a new family. I will give you descendants. I will give you new hope, new purpose, and I have chosen you. I'm going to work through you. God was going to continue the process of recreation through this man named Abram. From the very beginning of our story, we see the same thing over and over. We keep seeing God's mission to not just let creation suffer with whatever they choose to do, the consequences of sin, but instead to provide a way for them to be in relationship and to complete God's purposes together. So Abram followed God's call.
So Abram left just as God said, and Lot left with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot with him, along with all the possessions and people they had gotten in Haran, and set out for the land of Canaan and arrived safe and sound. Abram passed through the country as far as Shechem and the oak of Moreh. At the time, the Canaanites occupied the land.
Canaanites, wow. They were quite a bunch. But you know what? Abram believed in the blessing of God. He believed that somehow through his family, all the families of earth would be blessed. But there was a problem. Does anybody know what the problem was with having a lot of descendants? Anybody know? Sarai couldn't have children. She was barren. How are we going to have a lot of descendants if the wife can't have children, right? But if God's in charge, God's going to make it happen, right? And we're going to start learning something else. We're going to see this theme of barrenness come up. So be listening for it in our story, because what is barrenness but a feeling like we can't do it on our own? We can't do it by ourselves, and we have powerlessness, not power. Over and over, we're going to find in our limitations And in our powerlessness, God's going to supply what we need. So, God acts to give life. Here's what happened next.
God appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your children. Abram built an altar at the place God had appeared to him. He moved on from there to the hill country east of Bethel, and pitched his tent from Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. He built an altar there and prayed to God. Abram kept moving, steadily making his way south to the Negev. Then a famine came to the land. Abram went down to Egypt to live.
He went down to Egypt. Egypt was not good to Abraham. Or maybe Abram was not good to Egypt. Because while he was there, that old desire for self-protection came up. That self-preservation thing became more important. His wife, Sarai, was a looker. She was amazing. And he was worried because he said, one of these men's going to want you for their wife, and they're going to kill me to get you. And so he came up with a plan.
As he drew near to Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, Look, we both know that you're a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, you're going to say, Aha, that's his wife, and kill me. But they'll let you live. Do me a favor. Tell them you're my sister. Because of you, they'll welcome me and let me live. When Abram arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians took one look and saw that his wife was stunningly beautiful. Pharaoh's princes raved over her to Pharaoh. She was taken to live with Pharaoh. Because of her, Abram got along very well. He accumulated the sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men and women servants, and camels. But God hit Pharaoh hard because of Abram's wife, Sarai. Everybody in the palace got seriously sick. Pharaoh called for Abram. What's this that you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she's your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I'd take her as my wife? Here's your wife back. Take her and get out.
Pharaoh had Abram and his family escorted out of Egypt. So much for being a blessing for others. Here was a man of great faith, but like us, he also had ordinary fear. And fear causes problems. It was going to take an awful lot of trust in God to develop that faith to where it needed to be so God could get past that fear and God could use him the way God needed to use him. What would God do? Big order. Well, Abram returned from Egypt and he settled in Canaan among these very warlike people. They practiced sacrifice, human sacrifice, including child sacrifice. And the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, Do not fear, Abram, I will protect you. I am your shield, and your reward will be great. And Abram replied, My reward? Lord, what reward? You haven't given me any children. My servant Eleazar is my only heir. And God said, I want you to come outside your tent. And so together they went outside and they looked up into the night sky. And he said, I want you to try and count all of those stars. That's how many descendants you will have. And he made a covenant with Abram. He said, you can count on me. You can trust me. And God declared him righteous in his faith. 10 years went by. Abram believed God's promise, but after 10 years, he said maybe he needed to help God out a little bit. Maybe God didn't really mean for his wife to have a child. I mean, Sarai was pretty old. And so maybe he meant for him to sleep with somebody else. So he did. Sarai's maidservant, Hagar. He slept with her, and they did have a child, Ishmael. And he had a son. But then about 3 years later, God came to Abram and said, It's time. It's time for you to be the father of the son through whom I will work my covenant. You are going to have a name change. From now on, your name is no longer Abram, exalted father, but Abraham, which means father of a multitude of nations. Wow. And your wife, Sarai, her name is changed too because she has been chosen to be the mother. Your wife Sarai will now be called Sarah, which means princess of a multitude. I will bless her and give her a son. She will be the mother of nations. And Abram, completely believing and trusting in God to the end, said, wouldn't it work just to bless Ishmael? And God said, no. I promised you a son from your wife, Sarah. It is with him I will establish my covenant as I promised. But I have heard you, and as for Ishmael, I will bless him, and I will make him a great nation too. But my covenant I will establish with the son whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. And the sign of the covenant was circumcision. When Abraham and Sarah heard the news, though, they laughed. And so when their son was born, they named him Isaac, which means laughter. God had chosen Abraham to be the one through whom the task of recreation, of mending this broken universe, would continue. And God had entered into a covenant with him. But in order for God to depend on Abraham to carry out his part of the bargain, he had to completely follow and trust God. Completely. He needed a test. What could God do to know for sure that he could trust Abraham, and in fact, Abraham trusted God? Now, we know that what follows is a test. The writer of Scripture tells us that. But an awful lot was riding on Abraham's ability to be able to trust completely. And so, while we know that this is a test because it says so, for Abraham, this was deadly serious. God called out Abraham. Abraham replied, "Here I am." And God said, "Take now your son, Isaac, the son whom you love. You must go to the land of Moriah and offer him there on the mountain as a sacrifice." What? You're asking me to do what? Can you imagine? Any parent out here, can you imagine what agony he was in? How could you do that? And if he were faithful in that, which made no sense whatsoever, how could God possibly be faithful in his covenant? Remember, the descendants as numerous as the stars through Isaac, not Ishmael? Abraham was completely torn apart. But he knew that he could trust God. And can you imagine the agony that was there? But the next morning, he got up, he saddled the donkeys, he split the wood for the sacrifice to put on the altar. And he took Isaac and 2 young men with him, and they headed off for the land of Moriah. It took them 3 days to get there. When they got to where the mountain was in view, he told the young man, "You stay here, and my son and I will go together to worship." And so they went on. And that's where we saw them today, the old man and the boy trudging up the hill. Can you imagine how he felt with putting that wood on his son's back, and the son having to carry a piece of wood upon which he would die? Can you imagine having to carry that? Carry that yourself to the place where you would die as a sacrifice? Can you imagine what a father feels like allowing his son to do that? Well, that was Abraham and Isaac. And so they went up there, and when they got to that place that would be the place of his son's death, Isaac said, "I see the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" And Isaac said, "God will provide the lamb, my son." And as he prepared to sacrifice his son, the son of the covenant, he raised that knife, and a voice called out from heaven, "Abraham, stop." Abraham said, "Here I am." And the voice said, "Stop. Stop. Because you have not withheld your only son from me. I know that you trust me. Now trust me." And Abraham looked up and he saw a ram caught in the thicket. And he unbound his son. Can you imagine his fingers shaking so bad that he could hardly do that? And together they worshiped. And instead of calling that the place where I lost my heart, the place where I was about to give up everything, he called that place Yahweh Yireh, which means God will provide. The voice said, I swear by myself, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed, I will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your descendants. They will be like the stars of the heaven and the sands of the seashore. Because you have obeyed me, through your descendants, all of the nations will be blessed. God tested Abraham, and Abraham was faithful. But mostly this story is about God's faithfulness, a God that we may not understand at times. We can't figure out why God would lead us in a certain direction, or why we would have gotten there. Why is God asking us to do this? God, how did you get me here in the first place? Now, our culture is not like the Canaanites that were sacrificing children. So our culture isn't like that. But our culture does ask us some things and to sacrifice to it. And a lot of times we are ready to sacrifice like our culture says. And God says, stop. Stop. I don't lead you in that direction. You can rely on me. Now, this is a tough one. This is a part of Scripture that is a part of the story, so it has to be told. But it's an ugly part of the story. It's a part of the story I hate. I don't like preaching on this at all. And really, I think a lot of us are kind of like that. We want a God that provides, but we don't want the testing part, right? Some of us only think that God tests, and they don't realize that God still provides. Some of us believe and embrace both. And that was the kind of faith that Abraham had, and the kind of faith that made him able to be a blessing to the world. This is not a faith that comes easily. Faith doesn't come without anguish and agony sometimes. Faith like that, however, is what makes all the difference. Is your faith like that? A faith that will make all the difference to you and to those around you and those who will follow you. We're on that same journey. Can we trust God even when it doesn't make sense to us? It did to Abraham. And so the story continued. It continued on through Isaac and through his son Jacob. God renewed the covenant with each one of them and gave them miraculously children as well. And repeated that same promise to them of descendants and of God's blessing. And God added a new promise, his presence, something completely unheard of, a God of creation who would be not only wholly other, but always present with all of us forever. And so when we gather again next week, we're going to hear about what happened when the people traveled with God, and a God who traveled with God's people. How God goes about fulfilling that covenant that he made. How God continues the work of recreation through a people. How even when we fall short, God remains faithful to the end.